Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is, I guess, our resident bard, Mackenzie.
Hi, how's it going?
I,
It's
abs-
me, ya bard.
I absolutely loved your rendition of, what's the name of that song? Just
So
something.
me.
Yeah, sure. Something from The Sound of Music. I haven't seen that movie in years, and I don't intend to watch it again. So
Why not? It's really good.
I have other things to do. You
Like
know,
what?
okay. Well, first of all, work and stuff and school. But
You don't work.
that's true. It's a myth. Work is a myth. It doesn't mean anything. Whatever. No, but I don't know. You know how fast I watch movies. By the time I finish watching the ones that I actually do want to watch and get back to The Sound of Music, might as well say that I'm never going to get to it.
Break the cycle. Break your chains
The chains
of yourself. Be
interesting.
a better man today than you were yesterday.
By watching Julie Andrews sing on a hill?
I mean, it's pretty damn good singing.
That's true. That's true. She is delightful, though.
I think the last time I saw it was a couple months ago with my sister. God damn. It's
Oh, yeah.
really good.
It does hold up.
Oh,
'Cause
yeah.
I saw it as a child. Like,
It's just got
Anyway.
such catchy songs as well.
oh yeah, for sure. I remember elements of it, and like, there's a reason why this movie and others kind of are remembered. So yeah, I'm sure I would like it if I saw it again. I'm not someone who cares about, musicals.
Anything?
This has nothing to do with anything we're talking about today. Today, we're going to be kind of doing a sequel, if you will, to our last episode, where we talked about a rise in nationalism and national spirit in French Canada. And we're going to kind of do something similar, but with English Canada today, with a different poet, obviously.
Patrick, we're doing this in chronological order. Everything's a sequel. Everything's a sequel.
History is a sequel to itself?
Yes.
Okay.
The Roman Empire is just Greek Empire 2.0, this time with more discipline.
Wow. Okay. And I mean, yeah, that actually does make sense, because every empire subsequent just modeled itself after the Roman Empire, except with more violence. So there you go. That actually works.
World War II is just a sequel to World War I.
Anyway.
And then before that, there was the prequel, the Great War.
We're both extremely tired, but I love it. Today, before we get started, we obviously want to thank the people who make this show possible, whatever this show is. So obviously, we like to thank our patrons, Craig, Jessica, Elise, and obviously anyone who wants to donate is always welcome if you don't want to give a monthly fee. So today we're actually going to be talking about Charles Sangster, who was actually a really big deal in his time. Despite not being a professional poet, which is a common theme in Canadian letters forever, he was actually considered like pretty much the gold standard of poetry in Canada at the time he was writing. So mostly in the 1850s. Right. So, had you ever actually heard of Charles Sangster, Mack, or like usual,
No.
not at all?
Not a word.
Right.
Not most Canadians are never going to hear about actual Canadian poets. You got to look for that stuff.
Absolutely. And especially not like poets that, existed at this point, was almost born 200 years ago in 1822. So, of course not. But he's kind of very well noted, especially for the time, because he was known unofficially, similar to Octave Crémazie in our last episode, as a kind of colonial poet laureate. And by colonial, I mean pre-Confederation poet laureate. And so he was actually commissioned to do some poetry during official events. His poems at the time were extremely well respected, despite their flaws, and there are many, and we'll get into that. But generally speaking, this guy kind of represents the emerging sensibilities in Canada at the time, in this kind of Victorian era, and this rise in nationalist sentiments that relate specifically to certain elements, namely military culture that we're going to see a bit of, and nature, which are kind of two very important facets of English Canadian nationalism at this time. So, just a quick overview of who Charles Sangster was. He was born in Kingston, Upper Canada in 1822. And very quickly, he left school in order to make cartridges during the rebellion of 1837 against the rebels. He was a loyalist, or whatever that term meant at the time, and he remained at the fort where he was stationed, that is Fort Henry, as a clerk until 1849. After which he kind of turned to a career of writing and publishing. So he was in journalism as an editor of the Amherstburg Courier, and he would eventually move on to being a proofreader and other such jobs. So he was a reporter. He worked for newspapers like the British Whig and the Daily News, both of which were based in Kingston. I don't think either of them are still around today. In 1868, so after Confederation, he would actually move to Ottawa, and there he would have a post within the post office department. And he remained there until he retired about 20 years later in 1886. He is one of many civil servants to become a writer in Canada. This is something we'll discuss as we address these various civil servants throughout our history. Many of what we call the Confederation poets, for example, so Duncan Campbell Scott, Smith, all those kinds of people, Archibald Lampman, were pretty much government clerks, which, again, no surprise here, is kind of indicative of the state of writing in Canada, where you needed an actual conventionally recognized job in order to live as a writer. Nothing new there. In terms of our history, right, we are not going to cover a whole lot of it today, simply because we're pretty much in the same period as we were talking about with our Octave Crémazie episode. So there's not a whole lot new that we're going to cover as it stands in terms of the grand scheme of Canadian history. It's mostly the same. If you want absolutely the historical background, you can listen to that episode again, or at least like the first half hour or something like that. So in terms of what specifically stands out for our episode today, there are two things that I think we should mention. The Crimean War that happened in the 1850s, and reciprocity treaties, both of which sound kind of boring looking back on them now, but are extremely important to the conception of Canada at that time. The reciprocity treaty, obviously, because, well, it's with the US, and we can't do anything without having some kind of relation to the United States here in Canada, apparently, especially at that time. So yeah, do you know much about the Crimean War, Mack?
I feel like I knew more about it before, but it's very rusty.
Well, for our purposes here, right, there's very little that we actually need to know. It was mostly an imperial war that was fought between...
When aren't they imperial wars? Let's be real right now. If it's not an imperial war, it's a civil war.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it depends how you look at empire, but I don't know, like, there was war... Yeah, okay, never mind. I was good. Yeah.
It's
okay.
that, or Australia's waging war against alpacas or something, no?
Australia against emus? That's
the one.
I guess that
and
falls
even
under...
then, that's probably imperial.
I don't know. Is it imperial or civil? Which one is it in this case? Is it
They're not people, so it doesn't count. They're not citizens.
Exactly. So which one does it fall under? It's not imperial either. What difference does it make?
It's imperial because they're doing it for their territory.
Yeah. So our Civil War, the American Civil War, was fought over territory as well, and slavery.
No, but that was between people of the Americas.
That's fair. Anyway, look up the Emu War. It's fantastic. So yeah, the Crimean War is a war that was fought in the middle of the 1850s, and mostly has to do with the Ottoman Empire fighting Russia alongside France and the United Kingdom. What this has to do with Canada is almost virtually nothing. Okay. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because of what it has to do with Canadians rearranging their own standards at home, right, as it stands for the military. So in 1853, going into 1854, the British realized that they needed a lot of troops to fight over in Europe. And up until this point in the 1850s, Canada really had no standing army of its own, right? And we can cover a whole episode on Canada's military history, and I intend to get there at some point, but post-Confederation. But, right, the idea is that for the longest time, we still just relied on Britain's army because we were still a colony officially, right? A kind of proto-dominion. So we just used the British army, and that was fine because it's not like we had any great conflicts here. So we had a few troops stationed. And whatever Canadian military existed here were mostly volunteers in the British army, right? This is an oversimplification for the purpose of our episode, but that's pretty much what it is. Come 1854-55, the British need a lot of troops and they remove a lot of them from Canada. And this kind of gives the impetus in Canada to form their own militia, right? And pretty much they would rely for the most part on volunteers as well. And it would take a couple of decades before a full Canadian army was established. But by and large, by 1855, a kind of permanent Canadian militia was established. So we're going to get back to why that's important, but I feel like that's a necessary context considering some of the poems that we're going to be discussing today, right? And the kind of imagination that comes with being Canadian and where Canada stands as itself and within the British Empire, at least for where English Canadians are concerned. As for the Reciprocity Treaty, this one I feel is a bit more important, especially not only as it relates to the economy, because it's a discussion that we have still today in various forms about free trade agreements, reciprocity agreements with the US, but in terms of actual geography and landmass, right, and just resources, which is another thing that is going to be directly involved in, that is going to be directly played with by Charles Sangster in his poems, right? The actual land, the nature, how that makes us feel, right? So in 1852, a reciprocity treaty was signed between, well, British North America and the US. And for the most part, not much changed for most of Canada. It changed a lot in terms of Atlantic British North America because it related directly to who was allowed to fish where, right? And so that has a direct impact on the St. Lawrence and the kind of maritime provinces. So in short, it gave the United States access to British North America's coastal fisheries, and it allowed British North Americans to fish on certain American coastal waters. So basically north of the 36th degree latitude, which is, I think, if I'm correct, around Maine, right? So everything north of Maine. I could be wrong here, but whatever. The point is, some people can fish in the US and the Americans can fish a bit in Canada, right?
Because that's very easy to dictate and keep track of, you know?
Oh, it leads to a whole series of problems, right?
What doesn't?
Honestly, right? It really leads to a whole series of problems, and eventually it would be kind of I know it would be eradicated. No, that's not the term. Not eradicated. It would be ratified. Sorry. And it would eventually be removed, and it would come back in the 1870s, and it would become essentially a huge talking point as to whether or not Canadians should be afraid of Americans. Which, again, to come back to your point, what isn't at this point? Like, every single thing we do is an excuse to be afraid of Americans.
That's our defining characteristic.
America. Yeah. Honestly, there has certainly been genuine arguments for that, right? You can definitely make that argument. Obviously, it lacks a bit of nuance, but, you know, I think it holds its ground to a certain extent. So at the time, however, the treaty was pretty popular. It mostly allowed British North America to kind of boost itself out of an economic slump that had kind of plagued it for most of the 1830s and 40s. However, it did, as we say, lead to some opponents, mostly because many Canadians or British North Americans were afraid of being swallowed by the Americans, right? It kind of providing an entryway for the Americans into the Canadian economic and political system. And actually, some Americans were fearful because they thought it would give British North America too great of an influence on the northern states. Because remember, this is a time before the Civil War. Tensions are heating up between North and South, but it's not quite there yet. And so this is very much something that comes up being, okay, well, we're gearing up towards this conflict. I think everyone knew it at the time. And what's that going to mean if, you know, the British Empire sides with the northern states that they economically depend on now? So all in all, this kind of represents many of the ways that Canada and the US would actually relate to one another going into Confederation. As I said, right, a huge part of the Macdonald's policy was what we call the national policy. So it would basically be a protectionist tariff in reaction to such reciprocity treaties. And even
reciprocity treaties.
And
a fun twist of words.
Even like decades, a century later, right, under the Mulroney government in the 80s, this exact arguments would be found again, right? If we start dealing with the US in a kind of reciprocal way, it's going to lead to us being swallowed by them politically and economically. And you see that again and again, right? So just this kind of represents this. It also, like I said, represents who controls what resources and how we relate to those resources, right? Are resources a purely national interest? And what kind of issues and sentiments arise from those resources? Right? So this is very much at the forefront of many Canadians' minds at this time. Also, I should mention this. I say Canadians for the purposes of this episode. Like you said, I'm not going to say British North Americans because it's long to say that every time. And I mostly mean English Canadians in this case. It affects French Canadians as well. But like I said, this specific time mostly relates to the Maritime provinces. And places like Upper Canada or Canada West were more economically stable than the French Canadians. And so they're more directly related into such things like this. Right. Also, in terms of the military, it was mostly dictated by English Canadians or British Canadians. So even things like this, while French Canadians were present, it doesn't have as much to do with what we want to talk about now. Right. So did you have anything that you wanted to mention here about the general history that I kind of covered here very quickly?
It's all pretty clear. If there's anything that isn't, there's probably mentions in our previous episodes.
Yep, absolutely.
We've been covering the same topic for a while now, building up to Confederation. So like
it all builds up, yo. But I'm a huge proponent. This, in case that wasn't quite obvious, I'm a huge proponent of establishing many angles. I firmly disagree with the idea that history is a straight line, right? That only one event leads to another. And I entirely buy into this idea that, you know, all these elements, small as they may seem, all have their own individual impact into what would later become, in this case, Confederation, but just the grand scheme of history, right? Yeah, I don't know. So I don't mind spending a lot of time on places like this. And for example, in the other histories that I read or listen about, I eat that shit up so much, right?
We know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this great podcast I listen to on British history. I'm 300 episodes in or something like that, and he hasn't even gotten into the 11th century.
Yeah, okay, but Britain's had a longer history than we've literally started I joined in on this, late 1700s, early 1800s?
Yeah.
We've moved a couple decades in a year.
Yeah. We also play one episode every 2 weeks, so whatever. Anyway, Charles Sangster. So as I said, Sangster kind of moves into this, it grows up and operates in this whole time, right? And so, Mack, you mentioned before we started recording that you read a bit of his poetry. The main one that he's known for, and that was kind of the impetus behind this episode, is very long. So I understand that you do not read the entirety of it. By the way, as usual, it's available for free online. It's in the public domain, so I will link to it in the description. So just going into this, as usual, the poems that you did read, first of all, which ones did you read? And what were your thoughts on them?
I think I did Absence, Faith, Festus, and then the one you suggested, Brock.
Right, Brock. Did you read From Queenston Heights as well?
I think I did a little bit of that.
Okay.
But I read like the first stanza
cool.
or so, and then...
Yep. Nice. And what were your thoughts on them?
It was good. You know, as far as it's made known before, poetry is not exactly my forte, but it's good.
Well, at least for the next episode, we're actually going to be talking about a novel, so that might interest you. And there's a TV show based on it if you don't want to read the novel.
Oh, mean, it's exactly what you'd expect from the 19th century, 1800s of colonial writing. You know, lots of very winding, very pitchy, lots of lamentation at times.
Yep.
As we've seen before in Canadian poetry, a search for a better time.
Absolutely. Right. I wanted to bring up, right, you said, you mentioned the ones that I recommended, right? So Brock and From Queenston Heights. And this kind of plays into the military aspect of the history that I mentioned. Because do you know what these were written about? Like, do you know the context behind them?
No.
Okay. We're going back, all the way back to our good old pal, the War of 1812. So,
which was definitely something Canada fought and won. It wasn't Britain.
Or Canadians disguised as Brits. Anyway.
It's something we should be proud of and put in all of our media all the time, even though it was over 200 years ago.
I mean, the fact that it was 200 years ago was definitely something that was worth underlying. I don't know. I think it's definitely something important in our history. Anyway, it's important because of how
we beat America.
Yep, exactly. But, right, it kind of comes back to what we were saying, right? So Queenston Heights and Brock. So General Isaac Brock was one of the people who was best known for the War of 1812 and his actions during it. He kind of became a martyr during that conflict at a battle where else than Queenston Heights, right? So Queenston Heights is in, well, at the time it was Upper Canada, but it became emblematic of this kind of grand battle against the Americans, right? Where you kind of see this Pyrrhic victory almost, where you have this great general in Isaac Brock. And in order to push back the Americans, he would sacrifice everything, even his life. And right, this happened in the I forget when exactly he died. I think it was 1813 off the top of my head. But this happened in the 1810s, right? And Sangster is writing this like 40 years later, right? Right around the time when Canada's military is being formed and right around the time where this reciprocity treaty is being signed. Right? And actually, Brock itself, the poem, I mean, was commissioned by the British government, right? It was commissioned to Sangster, who had already made a bit of a name for himself at this point. It was commissioned during an unveiling of a statue of Brock, right, at Queenston Heights that was being erected in the 1850s, right, in his honor. So considering this kind of brief history of the poems, right, does it kind of give you a new insight into some of them, or at least
that he was paid to write them?
Well, not just that he was paid to write them, but that, you know, what's going on at this moment that informs the writing of these poems, right? I'm just looking up Brock itself, actually, so give me a minute, but go ahead if you have any thoughts.
So you're talking about the fact that he was writing following the War of 1812 or during the War of 1812 in this time of Canadian nationalism?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was following this, and he wrote this poem in the 1850s, just as these monuments and these kind of ideas about the War of 1812 were resurfacing, right? And he was commissioned exactly to write poems like Brock, in honor of these new symbols that we're creating right around this time of the War.
Well, then he's trying to shift history. He's trying to shift the narrative. He's trying to make it so that, because if they were bringing back up the War of 1812, then you bring back up the fact that Britain played a major part in that, therefore stay with Britain. And if you're Sir John A. Macdonald and you want to get away from Britain, you're going to want to shift the narrative to make it more like Canada won the war. And we kind of know that's true, that's become the narrative. That's what it's still going on today, where Trudeau and prime ministers before him all say the same thing. Canada won the War of 1812, but we didn't. We weren't even Canada at the time. We were a British colony still.
We were Upper and Lower Canada.
We were still a British colony. We were Britain's bitch. We did what they wanted, and they came and our sugar daddy came to save us from the evil Americans. Mm-hmm. So now you want to. It's a great example of propaganda and changing the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also funny how this guy who's now called the Canadian National Poet later on isn't actually brought up right away in a post. If you're looking at everything, we have everything here. We don't see. It doesn't look like you talk a lot about his post-Confederation work.
No, it doesn't do much post-Confederation.
Because now they need to establish a new canon as Canada. So therefore, their national poet, as he were, is no longer useful. To therefore, he gets tucked aside.
Yep, absolutely. He would continue to write certain things. Like, just in general, this was something that he openly admitted. He would try to add a Canadian sensibility, so to speak, to his work. And what he meant by that, and that's where I was kind of going with his main work, the St. Lawrence and the Saguenay, was to invoke these Canadian ideas of this is where the nature will come in and general feelings, right? But you're absolutely right that at the time, this would have been excellent, right? For a empire that's trying to drum up some support for itself, just as Canada is kind of becoming what it would become, right? So for those who haven't read Brock or from Queenston Heights, you get certain stanzas like this. I'll read the first one. One voice, one people, one in heart, and soul and feeling and desire. Relight the smoldering martial fire and sound the mute trumpet. Strike the lyre. The hero dead cannot expire. The dead still play their part. Raise high the monumental stone. A nation's fealty is theirs, and we are the rejoicing heirs, the honored sons of sires whose cares we take upon us unawares as freely as our own. So this was actually the first two stanzas, sorry. But it goes on for about 6 of them. Personally, this is not my favorite of his. It's not great, in my opinion, but it definitely demonstrates where he's coming from with a lot of his poetry. It's extremely sentimental, and it, once again, plays into this martial idea of Canada, right? It's literally said in the 3rd line. Yeah, relight the smoldering martial fire, as something that drums up this kind of action, right? For a country that is often seen as passive, right? As, maybe doing things just because Britain said so or because America said so. He's trying, I think, very much to reignite this flame of, how would you say this? Pragmatism, if you will, of actually taking control.
Is this when
of
he was
destiny.
paid to reignite the flame?
Mm-hmm. He sure was.
Okay, so that's where he wasn't trying to reignite the flame. He was paid. Other people were trying to reignite the flame through him as a mouthpiece.
Absolutely. I mean, I say this, but also if you look at something like From Queenston Heights, which also is based in the War of 1812, right? You see very similar things, right? This one wasn't commissioned though, but you still see similar themes play out. Right. Although you will see more of the nature element that he's trying to play up. Right. So you'll see throughout references to Niagara Falls, these grand open spaces. One of the 4th stanza, I think, is definitely emblematic of what I mean here, that these elements still come up in his poetry nonetheless, where he says, here is the monument, immortal Brock, whose ashes lie beneath it, not more still than is the plain today. What have we gained but a mere breath of fame for all the blood that flowed profusely on this stirring field? 'Tis true, a victory through which we still fling forth the meteor banner being the Union Jack, to the breeze, and have a blood-sealed claim upon the soil. 'Twere better than defeat 1,000 times, and we have rightly learned to bless the name of the old land whose courage won the day, we the descendants of her victor sires, but dearer than 100 victories. So he's clearly, I find it interesting that he's clearly acknowledging that it was the old land, so Britain's victory, but he's reappropriating it for a Canadian victory. He's aware of its power. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's coming right around this time, right?
How does that feel, Britain, getting something reappropriated from you for once? Suck it. Love and regards, Canada. Let us become our own country, please.
Yeah. I find, personally, I bring up Brock because it's the one that most people know of him, but I find that From Queenston Heights is definitely more his work, right? And a work that definitely demonstrates more of the sentiments that are brewing around this time, right? And I bring up the military history of Canada in the beginning of this episode. But only because I don't think he necessarily made a direct parallel, but I can certainly see why the underlying ideas would be there of hey, this is an active discussion that we're having about creating our own. And then Britain is very publicly removing themselves from this country, right? The symbol of British imperialism that permeates in the War of 1812, that permeates in their military presence here, is suddenly gone. And we have to fend for ourselves, right? Against, again, not necessarily physically the only threat that we would have at this point, the Americans, but, you know, just very much extrapolating this physical lack with a kind of idealistic lack, right? This idea that, what do we do now? Do we fend for ourselves economically, politically? It kind of opens up this whole slew of questions that I think can very easily be extrapolated by what Sangster is feeling at the time, right? I don't know. Did you have anything to say about any of this?
About his extrapolation, his continuation of the Canadian project. And he probably does have, again, some form of sincerity that he wants to see. It's just that at this point, we've seen a lot of people who are doing a lot of the same things and trying to evoke a lot of the same emotions.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out what made him so especially different to become the Canadian national poet, besides the fact that he got paid to do so.
Exactly. I was just about to ask that, like, what exactly does this elicit more than anything else, right? Because we talked about this last time with Octave Crémazie, right? He does bring up a military past. We didn't necessarily address it within the same frame as we're doing now, obviously, but these themes definitely still permeate. The difference being, obviously, that Octave Crémazie is pulling from a French military past that is truly dead and gone in Canada. But, you know, Sangster seems to be reacting a bit more directly to what's happening at that moment. I have a feeling like that's pretty much the answer to your question, is the moment he's reacting. It's not the fact that he's bringing up these themes specifically, because as you say, we've talked about it a lot. Victorian poetry covers many of the same grounds. There is a lot of poetry that exists in Canada about the War of 1812. It's the moment, and I think the way in which he does it, because I think this is good poetry for the most part. And
no, I'm not saying, yeah, it's just, I'm still trying to figure out what makes it different, you know?
I do think there is a better quality to this than many of the poems that we've read.
That's true. I don't see the sales pitch as much, like we talked about with Crémazie.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that helps a lot, because this is definitely something, much like Crémazie, that we see a lot of at this time in Canada, is a questioning of what Canadian culture is and what Canadian literature is. Hell, I have a book that I pulled from for this episode, right, called On Canadian Poetry, right? And this was written in 1941. And even then, so almost 100 years after Sangster is writing, even then, the author E.K. Brown, who was a professor at the time at the University of Toronto, was saying, you know, there is a difficulty and a problem with Canadian literature not existing, right? So when you suddenly have these questions that permeate for so long, and you suddenly have someone who can actually grab onto ideas that are relevant for the time, and can do so in a way that is much more beautiful than anything that has been done prior to many people, right? That doesn't seem as derivative, that doesn't seem as pulled directly from Britain, but that does try to emulate a certain Canadian consciousness to an extent. I can see why people would grab onto that, right? I don't know. That's my 2 cents about it. But
the Canadian consciousness.
Hell yeah. We're getting into psychology that I cannot. Like, what is
speak to.
What is the underlying unconscious of Canada?
Well, if you want to know about that, you should listen to our comedy episode of In Pop Canada, where we talk about where Canada gets its sense of humor and how that sort of shaped our identity. It's a great episode.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be a background to a lot of Canadian writing, is this search for identity, because of the fact that we're stuck living in the shadow of America, in Britain, in France. And even then, we still search for the identity of whose shadow we're really in. If you ask Quebecers, they get all uptight and say it's France. If you ask people in Toronto, they'll say they live in the shadow of America. If you ask other places, it'll be Britain. I'm sure back in the day when it was out west, you could say people were in the shadow of Russia from the Russians coming over through Alaska.
Probably, yeah. I'm actually curious to know. Yeah.
But really, it's all just erased history that we're in the shadow of the First Nation tribes that were brutally slaughtered.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's all just one long search for identity. and it's been sitting right under our noses.
There you go. So yeah, did you have any final thoughts for the kind of military aspect of Sangster's work? Like where this comes from or anything like that? Or do you want to move on to...
So morale thing. It's, they didn't really have Walkmans and radios to bring into battle, but they had poetry. I've got a 200-year-old book sitting in a drawer.
Yeah. That
was my great-great-grandfather's that he took into battle for his own morale. It's their version of a Walkman cassette.
But it's interesting, right? Because again, it brings up the question of morale for the uncertain future, right? I guess, right? Because it's not like they were at war at this point. Britain was at war in Crimea, but Canada wasn't, right? The people of British North America weren't. So that's why I'm saying, right? It's morale for a different kind of war, quote unquote, for those that are worried about the US, for those that are worried about where British North America really lies. I think that's definitely an excellent point that you bring up. I think leads quite nicely into St. Lawrence and the Saguenay, the other poem that I wanted to talk about, because that whole poem, which basically takes up most of the book that it was published in, it's, for those who are curious, about 1,300 lines long. And it's great, by the way. It has its issues, certainly, but if ever you want a poem to read and that perfectly represents Sangster's capabilities, there's a reason why St. Lawrence and the Saguenay is remembered. It's really awesome. I think it has some wonderful merits if it's a bit long. So this whole poem is actually basically him, like the narrator poet, right, which we assume to be Sangster, going on the St. Lawrence River on a boat and imagining and letting his mind wander towards God, towards nature, towards the future. Right? And he's basing himself on a few things here. He's basing himself off of tourist books that were meant to incite people to visit Canada, right? He's basing himself off of his own letters that he sent during this trip to his eventual wife, which we know very little about, unfortunately. I always like to give as many people as possible a chance to like get a spotlight on the show, but we just really know very little about her. And yeah, basically it's 1,300 lines of him being influenced by the world that he sees around him, right? And letting himself imagine where this is all going, right? Where he's going within this world, where this world around him is going.
Where his nation is going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where are any of us going?
I think this is really interesting, right? And when I found out that a lot of this work, which we're gonna, I'll bring up a few passages here and there, but when I found out that this work was influenced by works in the 1840s and 50s that were fueled by and capitalizing on the increasing tourism of the region, I thought that was very interesting. But because, it almost fits into this similar idea that you're bringing up of propaganda that you see in Brock, right? You're trying to incite people to come here and make this country seem great, if you will, to the eyes of an outsider, which I think is definitely worth mentioning.
You're worth mentioning.
Thanks. Did you read any of St. Lawrence and the Saguenay?
I read the first couple of verses.
Okay, right. So what were your thoughts on that one?
Again, it's, calling for feelings of nostalgia, calling for a bygone time, nothing we haven't really seen before. Mm-hmm. This one, especially, my eyes started to glaze over as I was reading this one, just because it had felt a bit like what we've seen before. It did write very pretty. Again, like I'm not knocking his style or anything. It might just be indicative of me not enjoying poetry. Yeah. But I don't know, it's just, you say something like, and lifts my dead heart up like Lazarus from the tomb. Yep. There's very much a call right there. He's very much calling back as if there's some sort of greater time to be going back to. Mm-hmm. But and I'm sort of tired of looking at the past. I want these authors to start looking forward at the future of Canada instead of, trying to just say our future is the past. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting, right, that you bring up that point, because I've heard a lot of people discuss and criticize this poem, like as a critique. I mean, not necessarily say it's bad, but just examine this poem and call it less romantic as you are and more Gothic, right? And that passage that you bring up, I think, is pretty indicative of this very idea, because he says, I'm going to read a few of the lines he says in it: feeling and passion there forever bloom for her who by her love's mysterious power dispels my languor of my spirit's gloom and lifts my dead heart up like Lazarus from the tomb. Right. So
Talking about the St. Lawrence, right?
That's the thing, is that it's a bit unclear. And I think that's one of the reasons why this poem really hit home for a lot of people, is that it was much more interpretable than many of the works that came before, which were very straightforward and were like, oh, here's a beautiful mountain, and here's, oh, great Niagara Falls, and everyone's falling asleep, as you say, and slowly their eyes glaze over. But
and then they die. I have a camera now, so Patrick can see my face as they say these things. I'm very distracting that way.
You are, honestly. You know, welcome to Historia Canadiana, everyone, where every week we have an existential crisis about the meaning of our own life.
No. The meaning of Canada's life, Patrick.
But what are we?
Nationalism here.
Right. But right. What I was saying is, it is much more nuanced, I think, than many of the poems that we've read. And that's one of the things that a lot of people bring to, right? If we look immediately the line after the ones I just quoted, right, he talks about a maiden, but we're not quite sure who he is talking about. Is he talking about his love that's back in Upper Canada? Is he talking about the St. Lawrence? Is he talking about Canada, a romantic idea of the past? We really are not quite sure. It's very open to debate. And I think that's something that a lot of the poems in the past that we've read have lacked, is that nuance. Mm-hmm. And that makes this one particularly interesting to me. But the idea, right, that you were bringing, I think it does kind of point to the future in a sense. And that's where I'm going to come back to the idea of Gothic, right? Because the major difference with Romance and Gothic literature, there's many, but there is this sense of, right, languishing and wishing for a bygone era. But right,
woe is me.
Woe is me, exactly. Like, obviously, if ever you want,
essentially, it's boomer poetry.
Yeah. It's boomer poetry as depicted by Coleridge and Shelley. So,
and it gets shot. All my friends who study Shelley are gonna come knocking at my door. The fuck you say?
Yeah, well, good. They should be offended.
If you're not offending anybody, then you're not really saying anything.
Exactly. But I know. Good on Shelley. But right, say what you will about him, he is emblematic of this kind of romanticism, right? The Percy Shelley, I mean, and his wife, Mary Shelley, is more emblematic of
monsters,
the Gothic, right? Which does definitely have these elements of a fear of modernity, but it's informing that notion with horror and kind of a mystery. And that's where I think Sangster kind of skirts the line with a lot of this, right? With references to a dead heart and Lazarus lifting from his tomb. And throughout the poem, you'll see there are a lot of references to kind of mysteries in the forest. Sometimes that mystery is a Native American, so, do with that information what you will, but again, nothing surprising there. But you get certainly this unknown factor that's a bit terrifying, as the boat he's on is literally moving forward through time and space. Right?
Through time and space. The only constant is love.
Well, yeah, in this case, kind of.
And also in the case of Interstellar.
I don't think I've ever finished Interstellar.
Neither have I.
Nice. Point is, right, I think you bring up a fantastic point, whether it's from Interstellar or not. The only attachment that he can possibly have that's relatively stable as he's questioning his future, his place, his everything, is the love that he has for this unknown thing, right? That he only has this hope to find once again this lost love of Canada, of nature, of a woman, right? His future wife. And I think that's one of the reasons, again, why I'm kind of pushing back against what you're saying, that, yeah, I agree that we're lacking a lot of looking towards the future, but I think if you look hard enough in works like this, it certainly does, right? It may be vague in the way it does that, but I don't think he's such a hack poet that he doesn't think of this.
Yeah, no, 100%. Again, it's not me saying he doesn't. It's just I'm more, I think a lot of poets do think about this, and I think a lot of authors do think about this. It's always about how you separate yourself from the pack. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about this, but what do you do that makes what you're thinking about more important? What is his thinking that's different from Izzy or anybody else that we've read before?
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of answer that, right, I think that there is much more, both in poems like we read, like from Queenston Heights, and a few of his other ones, like the ones you mentioned. I think there's a pragmatism that emerges in his poetry that definitely does point to this idea of like, what do you do? Because one of the issues that I had with poems like Kimezi is that while they were good, they were nice for their time. They were kind of innovative in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, it was intrinsically rooted in a past that could not happen anymore, right? And it did lack this ability to move forward, right? Despite what Kimezi himself as a man thought French Canada should be, Kimezi as a poet definitely was rooted in the past, right? And rooted in this idea that France was better, right? And not moving beyond that. So there was a line that I wanted to bring up at the end of St. Lawrence and the Saguenay. At the very end, one of the final lines, so it's 1228. So where he brings up, I think, is kind of merging, as one of the authors I was reading about him says, he was kind of merging faith, utility, and action or pragmatism. So he writes things like, "Loved one, I hear the voice within, syllabling words that bind our souls and blend them for a nobler sphere of usefulness and action. Year by year ascending in the scale of being, far above the trifling mind's obscure career, and mounting to perfection, like a star, for whose triumphant flight heaven's crystalline gates unbar. My love is strong as yon enduring rock, deep as the thoughtful waters at its feet. Oh, could my willing voice find words to unlock its depths and free the sleeping echoes, fleet as the swift-footed chamois, they would greet the far surrounding hills with such a tale of passion as had never left its seat within the heart of man." Right. So I think this does, even if it's not quite clear, I think it does open up to this idea of like moving forward and like actually doing something with the thoughts that you're imagining and that you're trying to explain in poetic form.
Right.
But yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from, right? And saying like, come on, like do something else. And honestly, moving forward, I think this is one of the last poets that we're going to be talking about that does such a thing. Because moving forward, we'll have what's called the Confederation poets that I mentioned earlier. So Duncan
and they're
Campbell
looking
Scott.
More forward at the New Canada.
Yeah.
Because they're getting paid to, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, they're still deeply rooted in like a bygone romanticism, but their look is definitely much more future oriented than might be expected, at least in my interpretation of them. There's straight up, I've interpreted this as science fiction. There is straight up an Archibald Lampman poem that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head that describes the city as a literal monster from hell, and it's kind of crawling up until the countryside and swallowing it in fire and iron. It is an insane description, right? But it's very evocative of like the fear of, but definitely a looking towards the future. And I think it's very cool.
Right.
One of the critics that I've read about this, I think, brought up an interesting point, right? Where much like many of the poets that we've read here, Sangster kind of grabs onto the idea that poetry can be found everywhere, which was a very romantic ideal. Mm-hmm. And, it makes Canada kind of this epic thing, right? But that still can't quite make that leap into the future, right? As you were saying. So I do think that you're not the only one to feel this. And I do think that he certainly could have gone further, but I don't think it's invisible in his work.
Right.
So just unless you had any other thoughts on that poem specifically, I wanted to kind of move back a bit. So did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to bring up, or can we kind of move forward?
I think we can move forward.
Cool. So do you see the way that, right, because I've been alluding to this, or I've been directly mentioning this, right, that when I read the St. Lawrence and the Saguenay, knowing that the reciprocity treaty had just been signed into effect only a couple of years prior, to me, I don't think it's much of a coincidence that he suddenly writes this poem about waterways and entrances into Canada. Yes, it is an emblematic image of Canada, but I think historically speaking, even if it wasn't necessarily conscious, but unconscious, as we were saying, I do think that there is a link to be made between the signing of the Reciprocities Treaty and how you feel upon entering Canada, right? Yeah. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but while you think about it, maybe I was just going to elaborate a bit on that and say, one of the major elements of the Canadian poetic scene and literary scene in general was, how much of ourselves are we losing to this nature through survival, through our relations with modernity and stuff like that. And I think that the Reciprocity Treaty for a lot of people definitely represented that in paper form, right? This kind of merging of modernity and having to deal with outside forces while being directly tied to natural resources, right? And so when I was reading St. Lawrence and the Saguenay, I was kind of trying to put myself within Sangster's shoes, writing this and kind of imagining him going down these major rivers in Canadian economic, political, and cultural history, and kind of imagining this similar relation between being one with nature and being one with the future. And I thought that was very interesting. It honestly offered a bit of a new insight into the poem that maybe I might have been reading too much into it, but I thought was definitely worth engaging with. I don't know if you had anything about that, but...
About the engagement of the poem, or sure. Which part of it?
All of it.
What do you mean by all of it, Patrick? You have to read it, these things.
No, but just, right, the idea that the Reciprocity Treaty, like what it represents for Canadians, and the writing of this poem right around this same time, right? Just this whole idea of when the poem was written and what it kind of represents, generally speaking, for the Canadian cultural mind.
I mean, it's the shift to independence. We know that because, what happens next, Patrick?
In 10 years, not even... Confederation.
Hey, there it is, the big word again.
Big C.
Will we ever get to it? I don't know.
No, probably not.
It's it's that philosophical idea where you only get halfway close to things, and then you get halfway closer and halfway, but you never actually touch it. No.
Yeah.
Because you're always just moving halfway closer.
You kind of. That would be such a baller move, though. It'd be such a dick move. You end
Not
up
baller, just dick.
You do so many episodes and you decide to end the show just before we reach Confederation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a totally horrible thing to do. At least reach Confederation. Then we'll talk about the future of the show. Right. So you were mentioning before, right, that I think we've been kind of alluding to this, but I think it's interesting to think about who the intended audience is for this, right? Because we've been kind of skirting the line less directly of what nationalism means, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously we've indicated our own opinions about nationalism in the past. But I do think that regardless of our thoughts on it, this was a historical reality, that this kind of emerging sensibility was coming up. Right. And so I think it's kind of interesting to think about who the intended audience was, right? And who would have mostly felt this nationalist sentiment. I think that, speaking of Professor Brown and his work on Canadian poetry, I think he has a really interesting passage here that kind of opens up to this idea, where he says, Sangster's guard is almost always up, writing among and for a people whose reserve is almost stern. He has his audience in view and records his experiences and aspirations with caution. It is here, rather than in his uncertain sense of language, that his chief defect as a lyric poet lies, and it is a characteristic defect of art in a community where art is a stranger. It is easy to understand his silence for the almost 40 years of his life that remained to him after the experience of the Hesperus volume. which is a later volume that he wrote. Right. He even says, in commenting on his first poems, a reviewer remarked, a Canadian poet whose poems are far above mediocrity. Her mountains, her maidens, manners, morals, lakes, rivers, valleys, etc. And hope merits encouragement. Will he get it? The answer is not a simple one. Sangster received a great deal of encouragement, but it all seemed rather artificial and, in the end, insufficient. And I think, right, that was a long quote, but I think it's kind of indicative of where this kind of idea is heading. That, say what you will about this, he's writing, according to some people, for a bit of a higher class, right? But a higher class that doesn't necessarily care about the plights of Canada, that doesn't necessarily care about the lower things that might appear in Sangster's work, right? The nature, the poetry, the grand beauty of it. Right? What matters most to a lot of these people is a greater sense, I think, of military power and authority, this kind of sense of power. And that's why I think a lot of it, or at least the commissioned work, was military focused, right? It shows power, it shows strength, and it shows domination, much more than something like St. Lawrence in the Saguenay, which is beautiful and was recognized as such, but ultimately went nowhere.
Okay, I can see that, yeah.
Yeah. To me, kind of going off of that, it's indicative to me of kind of the dominant sense of nationalism that would emerge in Canada, right? So one that had a very narrow view of what Canada could be, something that is a better Britain, right? Or a Britain with more nature. Right? And it almost seems, like Brown said, as a kind of automatic nationalism, one that people reacted to out of a sense of duty and a sense of recognizing certain things, but that didn't really think about what that meant, right? That didn't really recognize that, yes, it was new in a sense, but it was also a bit stifling and stopped anything from going anywhere, right? And I guess that would be my final thoughts on this, right? We didn't really touch upon the nationalism per se until the very end, but honestly, right, this to me, this final thought that I have on it is kind of what I have to say about this. Right? There's very little I think that I would elaborate on it beyond this. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts on the nationalistic elements of his work, or what it represents, right, going forward?
I mean, I guess it's the sort of idea of creating a poet laureate. You can almost say he was the first.
Right, absolutely. But again, to what avail? Yeah. He's kind of gone into obscurity at this point. So his role as poet laureate was what in the end?
To get the ball rolling.
I guess.
To change the narrative on the War of 1812. Yeah,
I guess. Absolutely. By the way, when I found out that this poem existed, right, Brock and From Queenston Heights, which I read for an undergrad class, I was kind of pleased in a sense, because it was at that moment that I kind of realized, like, oh, hey, our kind of idea of that war has just been invented from the beginning. It's nothing new, right? It's not like Stephen Harper in 2012 that kind of invented that one. For some reason, that freaking war has always been the one that we've kind of gone back to over and over and over again, no matter what. And I kind of derived a lot of joy from that. Yeah, I don't know. Did you have any final thoughts about any of the topics we discussed today? It felt like a shorter episode for me. I don't know, maybe because I talked a lot, but...
I don't think so. I can't think of anything.
All right. Well, pretty much just to kind of cap off, Sangster himself died in 1893.
Kind of forgotten by the system that he helped to create, by the country he helped to create.
Yeah. At best, he was remembered in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in a kind of interwar period where Canada was coming out of the First World War and was actively creating and reinscribing what it meant to be, what it meant to have a Canadian literature, right? Just as it proved itself in the First World War under Britain's shadow and was going into the Second. But after that, I have to admit, there's very little on him. And you're right, he's just kind of an invisible pillar, I guess, of what became Canadian literature, right? And he never really became a full-time writer. He was always supported by his actual job, which is kind of a sad way to end this. But that's, again, the the way that Canadian letters goes, and still goes for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, do you want to take us away?
Sure, I'll give your voice a break for this.
I did talk a lot, I feel.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page, through Twitter, and by email. You can support the show through PayPal as a pay what you feel the show is worth, and through affiliate links in the recommended reading page I set up. You can find perks like extra and ad-free episodes on Patreon. Anyway, all this is optional, and the show will continue to remain free and independent, just like Canada did when it got into Confederation. Finally, if you want to, maybe, if you're feeling up to the challenge, you can leave a review on iTunes and share it with some friends. Helps get the word out there. We've grown a lot through word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
It helps boost it does. It's kind of crazy. But for now, I'll just say, and this is me talking, not Patrick,
Mm-hmm.
I wish you all an excellent health, and that I hope you and your loved ones can stay safe in these intense times. We'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.
Honestly, I'm kind of looking forward to removing that last part of the outro. It's like, in these tough times, just stay safe. Thanks.
Just wash your hands. Wash your hands, you filthy degenerates.
That's a great way to get a review. Call out our audience. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Cheers.